Welcome to my presentation, Caring for the Carers, Foster Carers and Vicarious Trauma. I have a personal and professional interest in this research. I've worked with young people and their families my entire working life, which is a long time. When I was teaching, I was an SEN coordinator or an ALN co. I was a child protection officer. I worked in a residential setting with vulnerable young people who would communicate their distress through acts of aggression. Then I became a foster carer. I was not rose-tinted about the challenges of this role, but I had massively underestimated the intensity of the role. Foster carers invite society's most vulnerable young people into their homes and into their families. The role is 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 351 days a year. Why 351 days a year, you might ask? The national minimum standard for fostering states that carers are entitled to 14 days leave per year. This is usually called respite. It might be helpful if I explain the legal status of all involved. The state, via local authorities or independent fostering agencies, commissions out the care of young people who cannot be safely cared for by their families. Usually a court-issued care order will allocate 51% of legal parental responsibility to the local authority, whose role is that of corporate parent, and 49% of PR remains with the young person's birth parents. From a legal perspective, foster carers are not part of this picture. The national minimum standard states that one of the roles of the foster carer is to advocate for the young person in their care. The foster carer is also tasked with promoting and facilitating contact between the young person in their care and their biological parents. Young people in the care of the state are allocated a local authority social worker. The statutory expectation is that the local authority social worker will visit the young person at 6 weekly intervals. Foster carers are allocated a supervising social worker who meets with the foster carers for monthly supervision. The local authority will appoint an independent reviewing officer, or IRO, to lead regular reviews of the young person's needs and care at 3 monthly or 6 monthly intervals. The young person might have involvement with the virtual school. There might be medical professionals involved in supporting the young person. Foster carers might find themselves disagreeing with decisions that are made about the young person's needs and care. For example, if a young person attends school for 30 hours a week, they might spend the remaining 138 hours every week with their foster carer. The observations of the foster carer carry little weight when the legal status of the foster carer is that of therapeutic bed and breakfast proprietor. I'll give you an example. When I was a teacher with responsibility for SEN and child protection, SEN is special educational needs, by the way, apologies for that, I would attend reviews for young people in foster care. My observations and feedback would be met with respect from other professionals. When I attended my first meeting for my son, wearing my new foster carer hat, I quickly learned that despite still being me, sitting in a meeting I had attended many times before, the change of hat had seemingly demoted me to the role of village idiot. I am unable to bring to mind another workforce that is expected to work with this level of intensity. Let's have a look at the data. So we have discussed some of the challenges facing the sector. It's low status, low pay, and there are inevitably issues around recruitment and retention for reasons that go quite broad and quite deep. So the research that I have been fortunate enough to do, it was a very large, relatively speaking, a very large data set of over 1,200 respondents. So the breakdown here, as you can see, the majority of the respondents are living in England. As I've mentioned, I'm unable to bring to mind another workforce that's expected to work with this level of intensity. Foster carers, as I've stated, are rarely drawn to the profession by the status or the pay. There is an expectation that foster carers include the young people in their care as if they were a member of their own family. This makes complete sense if we wish for society's most vulnerable young people to have the best opportunity to heal from their trauma. I refer to trauma not for dramatic effect, but because being displaced is traumatic. Whether we find ourselves displaced due to war in the case of refugees and asylum seekers, or because our family is not able to meet our needs safely. We're moving towards a shared understanding that trauma often presents itself in ways that are considered antisocial, dysfunctional, and maladaptive. So when I worked with vulnerable and trauma-experienced young people in a residential setting, I was frequently the recipient of painful emotions expressed through the medium of aggression. And then I used to go home. It's not unheard of for trauma-experienced and care-experienced young people to show their emotional pain as aggression. Foster carers I work with frequently report damage to property, or indeed that they themselves have been hit by a traumatised young person during an episode of acute emotional dysregulation. A little later on in the slides, we will really drill down and have a look at what the data tells us about these experiences. So we're beginning to appreciate that foster carers are exposed to the emotional pain and subsequent behavioural challenges of the young people in their care, with little opportunity for time away from their work. And again, the data bears this out. As has been identified in other caring professions, the risks for foster carers include experiencing their own emotional pain when learning of the traumatic experiences of the young people in their care. When foster carers invite young people into their homes and their families, it's not unusual for them to develop feelings of enormous fondness towards them. I have to self-disclose here that I was not a highly successful foster carer because our young man joined our family nearly 8 years ago and he's staying with us forever. Not maybe ideal from a fostering perspective, but certainly has worked out really well for my family. So other areas of potential trauma for foster carers include ending, both planned and unplanned placement endings. You'll notice I've avoided that because our young man's with us forever. So the biggest challenge, in addition to the challenges around the emotional connections with young people and the difficulties around endings, the biggest challenge arguably for foster carers is the risk of false allegations being made against them. And again, as we move through the slides, we will drill down into a little bit more detail there. So I have done a lot of talking and still haven't drilled down into the data. The reason that I have spent quite a few minutes going through the experiences of foster carers in a very general term is because unless you already have an extensive knowledge about the world of fostering, the background and the context are really important to understanding the necessity of the research. So now that you have a little bit of a picture of foster carers and possibly an idea that they might be an underrepresented and an invisible workforce, we'll start to have a little drill down into the data. It's worth mentioning that a barrier that I encountered in trying to study the needs of foster carers as a workforce was that I couldn't get my original proposal through ethics. This wasn't because my proposal was unethical, it was because there had been a change in Wales, which means that any research project seeking to explore any aspect of social care now falls under NHS ethics for the purposes of research. and NHS ethics approval is a lengthy process, often taking up to a year. Plus, the demands of the COVID pandemic meant that the pause button had been pressed regarding NHS ethics applications. So there is an obvious problem here in that vulnerable and largely invisible workforce, like foster carers, remains vulnerable and invisible because of an additional barrier that's been placed in the way of studying this group, certainly in Wales. So for practical reasons, I didn't want to delay completing my MSc, so my options included submitting a completely different research proposal or studying a sample of foster carers, just not any foster carers who are in Wales. So I was incredibly fortunate because my supervisor already owned an unused UK-wide data set collected on foster carers' experiences between 2018 and 2020. So I am eternally grateful to my supervisor and to the previous student for having been able to use this data set. So we will start to drill down. As you can see here, it was a large number of foster carers who were able to contribute to the data, and the challenges that foster carers face that were identified through the data that I had access to, 91% of respondents report not having accurate and appropriate information regarding a young person prior to placement. And this was self-reported as resulting in considerable stress, and that this stress subsequently caused them to consider leaving the profession altogether. Other issues faced by foster carers include not being included in meetings about young people for quite possibly a range of reasons that happens, and that is a source of stress to foster carers. It's a common experience reported by 60% of respondents, and it does result in significant levels of stress that then cause carers to consider leaving the profession. A very common experience for foster carers is supporting young people who are disappointed by their biological family, and inevitably lots of very big, very painful emotions there. So the figures here are high. 90% of respondents have this experience. 80% of respondents report elevated levels of stress in their own support of the young person who's going through those difficulties. And yet, remarkably, only 20% consider leaving the profession in the face of these challenges. Another big area for foster carers that was identified is supporting young people after they've had contact with their biological family. It can be very emotionally triggering, very emotionally dysregulating for young people, and the data bears this out. So again, a high number of foster carers having this experience, high number of foster carers reporting elevated levels of stress, and again a relatively very low number of foster carers reporting that they consider leaving the profession as a result. So some of this data gives us a picture of an incredibly resilient and dedicated and motivated and committed workforce. Quite remarkable. This next bit of data that we have in front of us, another very common scenario for foster carers is supporting young people who show aggressive or violent behaviours as a result of their emotional trauma, their emotional dysregulation. So again, we're looking at relatively high figures here for foster carers having these experiences, including destruction of property. And within this data, what becomes apparent is the vulnerability of foster carers. They themselves display some significant level of vulnerability whilst supporting society's most vulnerable young people. A worrying aspect of this is that 51%, so just over half of respondents, report not asking for support for fear of being perceived of not being capable of performing their role. There are then issues around potential for social isolation, with over 80% of respondents reporting that they're unable to maintain a personal life due to the demands of the fostering role, which is kind of obvious when we consider a little earlier in the presentation that the fostering role is 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 351 days a year. So if we move along, the arguably the most concerning aspect of a foster caring role for the vast majority of foster carers is the risk of allegation, the risk of a false allegation. And for entirely obvious reasons, all allegations have to be treated in the most serious of terms and investigated thoroughly. And in this data set of just over 1,200 foster carers throughout the UK, 37% of respondents report having had an allegation made against them by a young person. 78% report severe levels of stress, the highest levels of stress, and probably not surprising really that 68% of respondents who have experienced an allegation report having considered leaving the profession. So the future of foster care is an area of particular interest to me. There is enormous hope for foster care provision and a few challenges along the way as well. So despite the considerable challenges that we've discussed and we've had a little look at through the data, only 9% of respondents in this piece of research report having been offered counselling support. 73% of respondents believe that professional counselling support would or does have a positive impact on their role as a foster carer. So there's a chasm there really. For a future piece of research that I would probably love to be involved with, it would be really interesting to drill down of the 9% of respondents who have been offered counselling support. It might be really useful to have an understanding of what the outcome of that was for the carer in terms of their own well-being, and also what that meant or means for the longevity of the placement. Does stability for foster carers mean greater stability for young people in their care? We can probably make our own assumptions around that, but it would be very interesting to drill down and see what the data says about that. But that is a study for another time, unfortunately, and possibly not one for me, but interesting all the same. So I have a few links here to support and guidance. And I would like to thank you for listening to my presentation, and please do get in contact if there's anything at all that you would like to know about the work that I'm doing. And yeah, thank you very much.